We've been enjoying again, by the way, the kind of quiet start to our services. So if you've been coming a little early, it's been really nice to come and just sit a little bit with some music, especially after a noisy week. We had July 4th this week. It was noisy in my neighborhood. My neighbors have upgraded their ammunition. It is quite something. It's like a little Anaheim Stadium thing in our neighborhood, and we have a particularly sensitive large dog that we had to give some trazodone to. So like one for you and one for me. No, I didn't take one, but it's a little noisy, and but it's good to have a little quiet in the week too. So last week we let the author of Ecclesiastes, the speaker of Ecclesiastes rather, ask us 3 questions. We've started this series. We invited the text to ask us, how do you experience time? That was one question chapter 1 presented us with. The other, what do you hope to gain in and through time? And thirdly, what is the weariness you feel as a human in time? Because, as I said last week, we've entered into ordinary time, which is to say, our daily lives, how we, our recurring tasks, responsibilities, our sleeping, our waking, our relationships. But we sense in the light of Christ's coming at Christmas and his resurrection and the pouring out of the Spirit, ordinary time should be, well, extraordinary in some sense. The presence of God should be in somehow our recurring days and the cycle of responsibilities. But we are confronted with the teacher's frustration in Ecclesiastes with Chronos. It's a mere tick-tock of time, the relentless forward movement of time that is hard to grab. Time marches on, it's fleeting. It kind of eludes our attempt to control it, to store it up. We store up a lot of things, but you can't really store up time. It just keeps moving. If there was a playlist for our series on Ecclesiastes, and by the way, if anyone's so inclined, go ahead, create a playlist for our series on Ecclesiastes. I would say one of them would have to be, or at least maybe the lead song would have to be the Rolling Stones hit Satisfaction, as in, I can't get no satisfaction. That seems to be the implicit frustration of the speaker. He cannot get any satisfaction, and he might sing, though I try, though I try, though I try, that I try, I can't get no dun dun dun. I was looking for the dun dun dun. I can't get no satisfaction. This would seem to be something on his playlist. Now, you and me, because of subsequent revelation in Scripture, we know the ways and means of God's trajectory in time, his plans to restore the world. These weren't available to the speaker in Ecclesiastes at that time. But in spite of that, I think we can still relate to his frustrations and disappointments, his dissatisfactions or complaints about day-to-day time. There are so many obstacles to the good things we're trying to do at work, with our families. So much that time brings that gets in the way. There are so many frustrations with the world around us, right? So much that is wrong with it, and so much we can't control that comes to us in our daily news feeds. It's hard to be satisfied with how things are. And so I think we can connect with the frustration of the speaker. And in our section today of Ecclesiastes, the last part of chapter 1 and chapter 2, the speaker is going to recount, almost in memoir style. Ecclesiastes is kind of a memoir of his life. He's going to recount his experiments in trying to find satisfaction for us. But before we go on, we have to do one thing we didn't do last week, which is to ask, who is this speaker of Ecclesiastes? Now, twice so far, he's identified himself as a teacher, or some translations, a preacher. But he's also identified himself as a king of Israel, and in one place, the son of David, which of course would be Solomon. It's not unusual for ancient writers to speak in other voices or personae, to offer wisdom from the perspective of another, and in this case, a king. But it's highly unlikely, most scholars agree, that this speaker is Solomon, both because of the style of the Hebrew, which is later than that in Solomon's time, but also because he says in a few places, my predecessors. Of course, there would only be one predecessor if he were Solomon, and that was David. So it's unlikely this is actually Solomon. He's likely taking Solomon as a kind of voice. But I think we can trust that this person is not speaking just out from behind a mask, but as someone who has great resources, great wealth, great wisdom, possibly a king. And so he can speak authentically about the disappointments that having all these riches and all this power has created as he seeks to gain something for himself and has fallen short. See, he has the power to experiment. And he experiments with that question, that middle question from the last chapter, and goes big with it in our section, which is, what is to be gained from all our toil? What is to be gained from all our toil? So he's going to do two experiments, or recount two experiments in this chapter. One is wisdom. What is to be gained from wisdom? And the second is, what is to be gained from pleasures? For an ancient work, it's going to sound very modern. For what is modern life for our culture, but an infinite number of experiments in finding satisfaction. We live in a kind of supermarket of experiences, perspectives on offer for a meaningful life, or at least superficially, a way to occupy our time. So Ecclesiastes, as ancient as it is, sounds a little bit like our times. So let's take a look at what the teacher discovers with his experiments about satisfaction. And first, he's going to look at wisdom. So in verse 16 of chapter 1, he says, I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Now, he doesn't get too specific about what this involves, but like Solomon, I suppose he had all the resources of education, all the mentors and teachers and experts who were available to him. For many centuries, if you had wealth and time, you could actually read every book in existence. Imagine that. There was a period you could actually read every book. And he probably did. Or they were taught to him. Our speaker is a leader of Israel, too, and so he would have read the scriptures and been taught them, and have access to every religious teacher in Israel. He's going to maintain throughout the book that wisdom is better than folly, but in verse 17, he cuts to the chase, and he concludes, you know what? I discovered that wisdom, too, is a chasing after the wind. Now, it's important, I think, we understand his perspective. He is a king. And he has this vantage point of looking out on all human activity, all labor, all conflict, all disease, all sorrow, all things that break down, the whole economy. And what he's discovered is you can have all the wisdom and knowledge, but there's no silver bullet. There's no once-for-all fix for this stuff. There's no rest from all this trouble. It's just, as far as a king concerned, kind of whack-a-mole. Things fall apart. They get bent out of shape. He says as much in verse 15. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now, while we're not kings, you and I, it probably just takes us 23 minutes of the nightly news. That's, by the way, 30 minutes minus the commercials. 23 minutes of the nightly news to get to the same place as our king does here. We get to survey how all things are falling apart, except for the little feel-good story at the end about a dog or a child, which is nice. So while knowledge and wisdom are good, we discover, even just with a cursory glance of the news, that everything we've learned cannot fix everything. Even in our own little smaller worlds, we experience this. What he does conclude is what wisdom allows us to gain is a lot of sorrow and grief. And again, throughout the book, he will still proclaim the wisdom of wisdom. But he says, what's so frustrating is, we sometimes even know what needs to be done, and we can't make it happen. I read a book not too long ago by a fellow who dedicates his life to the elimination of nuclear weapons. But he expresses candidly at the beginning of the book that he knows nuclear weapons will never be eliminated from the world. That his efforts will be ultimately futile. And it's because What is broken or crooked can't be straightened. The will to power, the fear. And yet he finds his work to be meaningful work. And later on I want to ask why. Even when we can't fix everything, is it a chasing after the wind? So having been unsatisfied with the gains of wisdom, our king now in his experiments for satisfaction turns to pleasures to gain some satisfaction in life. And this, of course, is going to take a predictable course. He dispenses pretty quickly with laughter and wine in verses 2 and 3, and he doesn't really mean these necessarily in excess. But he finds that these don't offer any lasting satisfaction. So he turns to projects. The first we might call home improvement projects, but on kind of a royal scale, right? He builds houses, vineyards, orchards, gardens, parks, reservoirs, as kings did in antiquity. He tried to create a beautiful environment. He becomes an entrepreneur even, a businessman, employing a huge company of workers, read slaves, and amassing giant flocks. He amasses gold and silver, we're told, hoping that this literal gain will provide some satisfaction. He says, I denied myself no pleasure. And all the while, he says something curious. In verse 9, he says, and my wisdom stayed with me. And I think what he means by that is he's kind of paying attention to his own soul as he's doing these experiments. Like, is this going to give me satisfactions? What's happening in my heart as I seek all of these things? Now, we might wonder, what's this guy's problem? I mean, if I had his power, if I had his resources, if I create this beautiful environment, if I could deny myself no pleasure, I'd be satisfied. But that other part of us goes, I know stories of people who have that and don't. I mean, we have thousands of kings and queens in our culture, don't we? If we talk about wealth and the ability to have whatever they want, we have thousands of them, maybe millions. And yet we know their sad stories often. The emptiness and sometimes the tragic emptiness. So what is he really after? What kind of satisfaction is he seeking that he can't get? Well, I think we get a hint in verse 9. He says there, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And by the way, that means in history. I became greater by far. And in English, of course, the word greater is a comparative, like bigger or better or greater. He's comparing himself to something with that comparative. And he wants to be something larger than he is. We might say he doesn't just want kind of wisdom and pleasure for the day, but some surplus, something left over that he's trying to squeeze out of life, something that he's trying to store up, some larger surplus self that he's trying to amass. What he's comparing himself down around verse 16 is to the fool, and in particular, the fact that he, like the fool, are going to die. In verse 16, he says, like the fool, the wise must die. So he's looking at this and he's saying, all this stuff that I've amassed, all this I've worked so hard for, all this wisdom, all that I've been trying to accomplish, achieve, to be remembered, which, by the way, are all the words he uses. Accomplish, achieve, be remembered. He wants some surplus self, but he knows it's going to be washed away. That there will be no surplus self on this earth. That his things that he owned are just going to get passed on to somebody else. And his name's going to be forgotten. Or if it's remembered, as names often are these days when the internet is forever, it's sometimes not remembered well. The result is the things he should have enjoyed, the parks, the orchards, the food, the wine, the laughter, things he should have enjoyed become meaningless in this light because it doesn't last. And compared to that, he concludes it's meaningless. And then he says in verse 18, not only that, but I ended up hating all the things that I toiled for under the sun. You see that in verse 18? I ended up hating everything I had because it wasn't giving him what he wanted. I met a guy at a dinner party once, and he and I got on the subject of music, and he told me he had 10,000 albums. Can you imagine? 10,000 records, vinyl. And he could have been lying, I suppose. But I knew him, and he had the wealth to have acquired that much. And I said to him, that must be amazing. And he turned to me and he said, I hate them. I hate them. That was the most unexpected response of the evening. See, he clearly had looked to music somehow to bring him some ultimate sense of satisfaction. And he'd amassed this amazing music library, which he ended up hating, because it revealed what I presume was a reminder of failed efforts at disappointment, at satisfaction, and a reminder of his disappointment. I'm sorry, this is very sober stuff for Sunday morning. But I'm happy to say the speaker does not leave us with just his failed experiments in this chapter. He has gained some wisdom about satisfaction and contentment. And if your eyes will go to verse 24 at the end there, it comes in that one verse. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. Now, is our teacher in Ecclesiastes just collapsing again into pleasure? Eat and drink? That's not likely, since he's just told us that that's a dead end. But it is dangerously close to the kind of hedonistic anthem, eat, drink, and be merry, or what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, that if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. How is this phrase different? And I'll maintain to you it comes with the last bit of the phrase. Eat and drink, for this too is from the hand of God. By the way, it's the first mention of God in our entire passage today, and I haven't given you all of it. Up to now, it's been about all the speaker's attempts to achieve satisfaction. All the things he was going to build, all the things he was going to accomplish, all the things he was going to store up. He's looking for surplus. Some larger self, something left over. But here, finally, he admits God into the picture. And what does he learn? Well, as I foreshadowed last week, it makes all the difference to frame our lives not as a pursuit of gain, but as gift. It makes all the difference not to frame our lives as the pursuit of gain, but to the reception of gift. You know, in the studies of this book, this kind of passage, eat, drink, and be merry, or eat, drink, and from the hand of God, occurs a few times in this, and the scholars call it the carpe diem passages of Ecclesiastes. Kind of grab hold of the day. But I find that ironic because, of course, when we think of grasping, carpe, to grasp, we think of our hand. Grab it. But ironically, the hand here is God's hand, and things tumbling forth from it. We don't grab it like the Eucharist. We receive it. The American poet William Carlos Williams writes, "There is nothing to eat, seek it where you will, but the body of the Lord." There is nothing to eat, seek it where you will, but the body of the Lord. And we might say all that comes from the Lord. Yield it, says Williams, to the imagination. Imagine a world in which all the good things are tumbling forth from God's hand. This given life, this opportunity to see God's hand giving, for instance, food and drink to us is an obvious point, right? But in practice, you and I forget it, I think. Because everything, for instance, in our food industry, to be literal, is designed to obscure the notion of where our food comes from. We've not, until very recently, been encouraged to think about where it was grown, how it was grown, who grew it, how the land is being cared for. And of course, there's nothing on the package or the labeling that identifies its ultimate source as from the hand of God. Although any of you who want to start a food business and want to call it from the hand of God, please do. To actually see these things coming from the hand of God is to actually re-experience a little bit what God saw when he looked out in Genesis 2 and said, this is so good. Not meaningless, this is so good. And perhaps the preacher's words about eating and drinking are not just literal, about just food and drink tumbling forth from God, but metaphorical, that all things that we benefit from, we know are from the Father in our gospel passage today, who gives all good gifts to his children. That is why I've been urging you in our announcements to actually take up some form, if you haven't already, of daily prayer. And in particular, the daily prayers of things like Examine, where we go through our day, and instead of trying to gather some surplus from all this that is somehow going to result in a larger self or store up something for the future, I mean, obviously there's wisdom in that. But in terms of satisfaction, just to go through today with God and say, what was so good? What is the given life that I've been given? And maybe, as is often the case, to confess, where have I tried to store up something for a larger self, a more magnificent self, a greater self? Where have I grasped and not received? But there's more in this line than just eating and drinking from the hand of God. For the second part of the line said, there is satisfaction in our toil that also comes from God's hand, our work. I like that he still said toil. He's a realist, right? Work will always have that element of grind. But there's a chance here, too, to reframe work. We get an earlier hint in verse 10 when the teacher admits, as he's still trying to create this surplus self, he does pause in verse 10 and say, my heart took delight in all my labor, and this was my reward. Notice the reward, he said at that moment, was the delight he took in the labor, not the frustrating attempts at surplus. And here, too, it has to do with living a connected life. In eating and drinking and in giving thanks for this, we are connected vertically to God. But in our work life, we get to connect to others. For we get to engage in the stewardship of the lives of others. The pleasure that God had apparently in creating the world and saying this is good, in our work is on offer to us. Some analogy of it that we get to, in our work, stewardship these things to other people, whatever services they are that we bring to people, and say, this is good. This work I do is good, no matter what that work may be. I happen to know what some of you do. One of you works in a call center. Now talk about toil. Can you imagine working in a call center? I mean, you're just fielding complaints and frustrations all day long. But this person told me what a privilege it was sometimes to enter into this person's struggle, to comfort them, provide hope for them, provide services for them. This is the reward. To steward the lives of others. Some of you I know are in real estate. And while your clients may be in full consumer and gain mode, seeking some surplus perhaps, what you get to see yourself do is providing shelter, places for their families to grow up, care for them. You get to steward the good gifts of God to them. Some of you are teachers of knowledge and wisdom. And even as you foresee your students kind of over-focusing on achievement and gain, and you know that there's going to be disappointments as they seek to kind of cycle this into a greater self. It's like, oh, well, let that be. They'll learn in time. You get to connect them to God and even to the goodness of wisdom and knowledge. For indeed, in verse 26, which you don't have, the preacher doubles back and says, yes, it is God who gives wisdom, knowledge, and here's a new word for him, happiness. Wisdom can result in happiness as we use it to steward the lives of others. This too is from the hand of God. Wendell Berry writes, our responsibility as stewards, the responsibility that inescapably goes with our dominion over the earth, is the safeguarding or passing on of God's pleasure in his work, as we find this pleasure of stewarding the world and the lives of others in our work. To be a church for the sake of others, as we call ourselves, is also to find joy and contentment in our work. So, by way of application, I continue to invite you to wander through your days in prayer before God, thanking Him for the good things that tumble from His hand, looking for the opportunity to hand these good things on to others in whatever work you do, confessing when you hold things a little too tightly to create a surplus self, and opting each day to connect both to His giving and to your care for others. And Lord, we pray that you would help us do this. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.